is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my new guest. Nirupama Menon Rao was the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs in India. But not just that, she used to be our person, as it were, in America. She's one of the most scholarly people, both in the service when she was part of the Indian Foreign Service, but also outside the service, having written and is continuing to write many, many very insightful articles, books, and other treatises on how India looks at the world. I'm very delighted, therefore, that the ambassador has agreed to join me in this conversation. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hindol, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to begin by asking you, and one cannot avoid this today. We are literally talking on a day when, major things are unfolding in Russia. We're of course going to wait and watch to see what happens there. But talk to us a little bit about what this means for the India-America relationship. Because, as Prime Minister Modi's state visit, very successful state visit showed, there's always been this underlying conversation about India's defense ties with Russia, India's role and position in the Russia-Ukraine war, and so on and so forth. As the situation seems to deteriorate in Russia, what impact do you see this having on the India-America relationship?
Well, I would really focus my sights on the outcomes of the summit meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, the meetings that have just concluded in Washington, D.C., and the outcomes from those meetings, which would suggest that India-US relations have been taken to a new level. And in terms of, the sense of what these two countries, these two democracies hope to achieve in the months and years to come. The announcement of the Critical and Emerging Technologies Initiative last year, and now, of course, the technology partnership, the strategic technology partnership, which really adds meaning and substance to what the two countries call the comprehensive global strategic partnership that they have built over the last decade and a half. So I would look at the structure and the many touch points in India-US relations as indicative of a very strong, enduring, resilient partnership that is being built between India and the United States. I don't think it has much to do with India's relations with Russia, of course, which have been, which stand independently. It is true that India has a continuing relationship with Russia. It's a legacy relationship, and a lot of it is built around the defense ties that have lingered on, if I may use that word, from the Cold War days. And even as, there is talk of weaning off our dependence on Russia in the field of defense, that weaning off, unfortunately, has not happened as quickly as we would want it to be. So the three arms of the defense forces of India continue to be dependent a great deal on Russian equipment, and all our programming is built around that connection. But at the same time, over the last few years, we've been buying defense equipment and arms from the United States, for instance, 20 billion over the last decade. So that relationship is definitely on the upswing, even if, we are not, it's not anywhere as close in terms of volume with the connection that we have with Russia. But we operate about 8 US defense platforms, the aircraft that we bought, the C-130s, the C-17s, the Chinooks and the Apache helicopters, the P-3 Orion reconnaissance aircraft. And this visit has seen the announcement of a memorandum of understanding between HAL and General Electric on the transfer of technology, which is most important, and the eventual production of the GE 414 jet engines, which will come to power many of India's fighter aircraft in the future. So that is a momentous development, as also the decision to purchase the Predator drones from General Atomics, which will greatly help with our ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, both on our land borders and in the seas around us. So you can see the direction in which these ties are going, and in a sense, a kind of bend in the river, if one can say, where we are, I'm sure, in the years to come, going to move farther away from our dependence on Russia and build a very strong and resilient relationship with the United States.
I want to ask you, Ambassador, you mentioned when we were speaking before this interview began that the two countries, United States and India, have perhaps learned wise lessons from the civil nuclear deal that they signed, and yet not much came out of it. Could you were Foreign Secretary, you were India's ambassador to America, could you take a few moments and reflect on what those lessons could be? And indeed, in your opinion, would these countries have learned the right lessons?
I definitely think we've learned the right lessons. I think we need to impart a sense of urgency into all this, and the systems have to deliver. And for instance, the opposition parties have to be on board, and that's what happened, I think, with the nuclear liability law. It really ran aground in some senses and kind of created obstacles to the actual, establishment of the civil nuclear plants and the entry of the American companies for that purpose in order to build those reactors. So that didn't really happen. But although, you had our cooperation, our civil nuclear cooperation with France and Russia, and all picking up pace, because really what the Americans had done was to open up the universe for us on this, where it had been closed because of sanctions following, our peaceful nuclear explosion, and then the nuclear tests in 1999 and sanctions that had been placed on us. And America took that decision. It was almost like President Bush had that epiphany that somehow India had to be supported, that India was and that's a reality, a vibrant democracy, and the United States and India needed to create, as Condoleezza Rice said quite famously, a balance of freedom in our region. And that yielded a lot of benefits for us. And as I said, opened the universe in terms of civil nuclear cooperation with the rest of the world was concerned. So we owe it to the United States for that opening. It really, I think it was as if, we had rediscovered the world of civil nuclear cooperation, which had been open to us in the 50s and the 60s once again. So in a sense, that debt of gratitude that we have to America must be acknowledged, I feel. It's a pity that civil nuclear cooperation with the Americans didn't really progress. Of course, there's still room for that. And I noticed that in the joint statement and the fact sheet, there is mention of what Westinghouse proposes to do. And obviously that is not a closed chapter. But we've learned lessons in terms of how these systems have to deliver. And in the case of all these agreements that have been reached as a result of this visit, I think the institutions concerned, the departments concerned, the ministries concerned, will all have to work with a sense of almost, like I would say, missionary zeal to see that these agreements are implemented. Otherwise, it's just that we should not, I really think we should not be in a situation where, a visit has taken place and there are a lot of good intentions and announcements of the agreements that have been reached. And then, after all the excitement dies down, the bureaucracies, slow down, or they're not possessed with that sense of urgency to implement. I think the focus now should be on implementation, because the ground has been laid and the political will is there, especially and the Americans have done what they have not done even with allies and very, very countries with which they have very close relationships. They've done that with us, and I think our system should also now deliver on implementation. But on the American side also, there are steps to be taken. For instance, Congress has to approve the provision of these jet engines to us, because they represent the acme of high technology that the United States possesses. So it's really, a big prize that is involved here. A big prize, not a price, but a prize.
Does that mean, Ambassador, for long, defense ties between the United States and India have been plagued by what perhaps one could call the clouds of doubt? There have been commentators after commentator talk about, well, in a crunch moment, would we get the technology transfer? Would we even get, I remember until a few years ago, there were even questions about whether we would get spare parts. And some of that comes from some of our earlier experiences. Do you think all of this is a thing of the past today? All these doubts, apprehensions, these are things of the past. And we should no longer, after this moment, we should not bring those doubts onto the table.
Well, that is exactly what our Prime Minister meant when he spoke of shedding the hesitations of history. And I think, those words are really, that I think should be an article of faith when it comes to the future between our two countries, and for the systems within the countries, the establishments within the countries. It's time we shed, those old prejudices and stereotypes. This is a very different world. The geopolitical situation that we face today really necessitates a coming together of India and the United States, especially when we visualize the situation in the Indo-Pacific and the deterrence that we need to build against one country, we need not name it, but one country that has sought to really, I think the word that Susan Shirk used recently in her book, overreach. There's been a lot of overreach by China, and I think we need to build deterrence against that, and that's good for the region. So this relationship is good not only for both our countries, but it is good for the rest of the region. It's not that we seek confrontation and conflict with China, but as the motto of the Boy Scouts movement states, be prepared.
I want to ask you then, as the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, his state visit to America, in a sense, was about to unfold, articles appeared in the American press about India's positionality as far as a potential conflict between Taiwan and China. If it were to happen, what would India's positionality be? I'm, of course, referring to, a TELUS article which talked about how, this was a bad bet in a sense, though, of course, later he sort of clarified that in spite of India perhaps not sending, its troops to fight the battle, so to speak, yet it was vital for America to engage India. But there were all these sort of question marks. There, of course, are all these questions about values and shared values and how much the two countries shared values. Both have, commentators on both sides have very strong positions. Talk to us a little bit about this lay of land. First, since you mentioned China, and I really want to come to China, talk to us a little bit about your opinion on India's positionality if there were to be a future conflict between China and Taiwan.
I don't believe any country in the Indo-Pacific wants to see such a situation come to pass as a conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan. I believe that it is in the interests of all of us for China and the United States to engage with each other in order to reduce the tensions in their relationship and to introduce a degree of stability and a channel of open communication between the two countries that will obviate the need for such conflict. And I think that is India's position. Of course, India will defend itself strongly against China, as the situation along the line of actual control has indicated, even as China has indulged in what I may call a kind of land grab along the line of actual control. But we have strengthened our defenses, and we are prepared to take on the Chinese, even as we talk to them about disengagement and de-escalation. But as far as the situation in concerning Taiwan is concerned, I think it is incumbent on both parties, China and the United States, to ensure that the situation doesn't get out of hand, that neither country acts irresponsibly, and that there are measures put in place to ensure that tensions don't get out of hand. Because consider the outcome of a conflict in Taiwan. It's going to have horrendous implications for the rest of us in the region, far worse, I believe, than the war in Ukraine. Because Taiwan is so intimately and closely and intricately tied into global supply chains, its economic ties with the rest of the world, even as there are questions of its sovereignty, its economic connections, and the way that it trades with the rest of the world, the way that technology matters for all of us, and Taiwan is an epicenter, for instance, for semiconductor manufacturing, something that is vital for industry today across the world, manufacturing, and we're all affected, would be affected by a scenario where there is conflict in Taiwan. So that would be India's approach.
Let's talk a little bit about the values conversation then. That has been the other point of conversation that many people have brought up. And again, people have very strong views on both sides. Tell us a little bit about where you stand in that debate.
Well, I think values matter. Values matter in foreign policy, just as interests are crucial. And interests obviously are there, and it's essential to defend them, to protect them. And we serve the interests of our countries in terms of the policies that we deploy when it comes to the rest of the world. There's no doubt about it. But we start on the basis of certain values, and that is why India and the United States have, in a sense, also, apart from the geopolitical essentialities that are central to our relationship, values also do matter. When Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi spoke about democracy, spoke about democratic values, spoke about the rule of law, the defense of human rights and fundamental freedoms, it's because these values matter in the relationship. And they have mattered even from the time of the Cold War. I mean, from the time of our pre-independence years and the connections that were cemented between India and the United States, the fact that our first Prime Minister made that that important visit to the United States in 1949. It was because, the United States wanted to reach out to us as a fellow democracy, just to build a relationship that was solid. Never mind that did not come to pass, and there were estrangements, mainly brought about due to geopolitical differences between the two countries, not because there was a clash of values. Perhaps there was a clash of interests, but there was never a clash of values. And I think democracy has always been fundamental to the definition of the strategic partnership between India and the United States.
Let's talk a little bit about India's own positionality as far as conflict with China is concerned. One of the arguments that have come out strongly in defense of India from America today is that, well, it's all very well to ask whether India will step up if there's a conflict in Taiwan or on Taiwan. it is important to remember that when India fights its own battles with the Chinese to defend its own sovereignty, it does not seek America's material help. And today, America perhaps doesn't need another country the size of India to turn to it for assistance, active assistance, if there is a conflict. Number one, where do you stand on that argument? And number two, if you think that argument is valid, is it perhaps true that this is not prominently underlined in Indian public discourse?
Well, in the event of a conflict with China, and I sincerely hope that does not come to pass, I think we can count on the support of the United States. Now, support doesn't mean active involvement. Obviously, we have to fight our own battle with China. And that is something we should gird ourselves for. We should prepare ourselves for. But the fact is that you can expect the United States, given, the close ties that we have developed on the defense and security front, in terms of, the sharing of information, the sharing of intelligence, perhaps the provision of military equipment. I think you can count on that support, just as we did receive that support during the conflict of 1962 with China, when the Kennedy administration came to our assistance when we needed it. So I think the United States is going to be a friend in need. But India today, of course, is in a much better position to be able to deal with a confrontation or a conflict with China in terms of the preparedness, in terms of our knowledge of the terrain, in terms of our appreciation or understanding, let us say, of the threat from China and the preparedness that we have built up over the years. So in that sense, our fighting capability vis-a-vis China has never been better than it is today, and it's bound to improve. And similarly, India's geographical position, we are the heart of Asia. In many ways, we are the middle country, although the Chinese keep talking of themselves as Chunghua, the middle country, but in Chungguo, rather, the middle country. So in many senses, we are that middle country. Look at our position in Asia. We border the Asian heartland, the rimland, as it were, but we are also so centrally placed as far as the oceans around us are concerned. Our connections between the Indian Ocean and through the Malacca Straits into the China Sea. So India's, whole geographical position makes it a very, very potentially a very powerful geopolitical force within our region. And I think the Americans recognize that, which is why our two navies exercise together. The military exercises that we have conducted have included exercises between our two armies on our land borders close to China. So that is an indication that our relationship today is definitely a matter of trust. And trust definitely has a premium in every relationship between countries, and it exists in abundance between our two democracies.
Talk a little bit about something that you mentioned a little while ago, technology partnership. This is emerging as perhaps, who would have thought, many people have pointed out that who would have thought that an America-India joint statement would have literally as its core message the connections between the two countries share in technology exchange. And it's not one way anymore. It's not India as the supplicant, requesting high technology. India is also providing today, a platform for digital public infrastructure in a manner that most countries are not able to. Talk to us a little bit about what this means. Can India and America build the new digital public commons, as it has been called?
Yes, I like that phrase, digital public commons. And I was listening to the president of NASSCOM, Debjani Ghosh, speaking a few months ago, and she spoke about the Indian technical industry's capacity to plug and play into the United States ecosystem. I think that's a very important statement. So when we reimagine the future of India-US relations, I think this is the kind of thinking that should shape our attitudes. So technology is at the heart of this partnership. It is a critical and fundamental and crucial pillar of the strategic partnership today, which is why the initiative on critical and emerging technologies is being led by the National Security Councils of the two countries, which is, I believe, proof that the two governments want quick implementation. They are serious about taking these initiatives forward, and they want to see results. So I think these points have to be kept in mind when we talk of the technology partnership. And already over the years, the science and technology relationship between India and the United States has been a very, very important node in the relationship. What we're thinking today, or what we're visualizing today, is an amplification of that relationship, a very, very strong empowerment of what we are doing on the science and technology front. There is a huge talent pool in India for that. I mean, we will have to skill it further, no doubt, but there are indications that we're going to be working together, India and the United States, to do that. And the announcement about the GE jet engines, the purchase of drones, Predator drones, which are most likely, as the announcements go, going to be assembled in India. All these, I think, add to the defense ecosystem that we are planning to strengthen over the years. And I think there will be an infusion of a transfer of technology and skilling that will enable us to strengthen our own capacity to be more self-reliant in defense manufacturing. And apart from that, the Critical and Emerging Technologies Initiative is looking at AI, it's looking at quantum, it's looking at semiconductors, it's looking at clean energy, it's looking at space. So, literally from the seas to the stars, as the joint statement said, I think this is the wide arc of the relationship today, and it's really going to create new history, I believe.
I want to talk a little bit about manufacturing, which you just mentioned in your answer. In the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about friendshoring, and that, of course, came about after the experience that the world had during the COVID pandemic. Now, India already has an experience of becoming an outsourcing destination after the Y2K bug, when the millennium turned, so to speak. But today there is new resurgent hope that India will truly be a proper back office, not just the sort of most basic tasks, but as the profusion of GCCs is showing us today, really the research and development hub for many of the world's biggest companies, and that number will continue to grow. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this entire, display, expand. Even today, there is a lot of manufacturing still very concentrated in China. Do you believe that some of that, or a large part of that, genuinely could move? Do you think friendshoring could really be a success in the India-America relationship? And do you really think this back office dream and R&D, becoming a global R&D hub dream, can actually fructify?
Well, I think this whole talk of the partnership is about the transfer of technology. It's about training a workforce for the industries of the future. It's about creating those resilient supply chains, which, in a sense, to be very frank and blunt, very candid, is to blunt Chinese capability, because, too much reliance on supply chains that involve, the import of components and critical materials from China is not going to help us, given the geopolitical churn and the growing rivalries that we see between China and the United States, particularly. Our economic linkages with China continue despite the tensions along the line of actual control. But India has also tried I think consciously to de-risk, even if decoupling has not happened, de-risk our connections and to move away from the connections that had been built up with China, particularly in strategically vital and important areas like telecommunication or projects in our border areas or in electronics, or for instance in the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs that we need for our pharmaceutical industry. So that is definitely happening. I think what India and the United States now, when they talk of friendshoring, when Secretary of the Treasury talks of friendshoring, it's essentially that, you know, India has to become part of this global supply chain through augmenting of our manufacturing capabilities, through the augmentation of the through the infusion of the technologies of the 21st century, that we need to create that very empowered workforce that can deliver on these fronts. So I really think that our engineering firms have to step up, and we have to get, you know, the mix of our engineering capability and manufacturing right. We've got to get startups involved. We've got to get universities involved. And I think, you know, this is a whole new program of action that stretches before us. And I think, you know, there's no time, we really have no time to linger. We have to move ahead with a lot of alacrity, with a lot of resolve, and a lot of focus. And our connections with the United States are the bridges that we are building with the United States are very important for that. You know, we have the capabilities, you know, our STEM capabilities. The human capital is available in India. But, you know, we have to really, in a sense, connect that capital with what is happening in the rest of the world on the technological front, and thereby, you know, build those capabilities. But I think India's success in the field of digitization, what we've done on payment platforms, what we've done in terms of Aadhaar, what we have done in terms of bringing this progress to people stretching across this vast country is really phenomenal. And it's something that is recognized in the United States, and which in a sense, I think also makes the United States realize and understand that India is a good and promising and potentially a very powerful location for investment.
Just a little bit about what more India could do to really deepen its engagement in these supply chains, you know, because some people worry, and there are two questions that I want to ask you here. Some people even today worry that in 2008, when the financial meltdown happened, India and India's, you know, very strong and powerful bankers were able to, in a sense, protect the country because the country wasn't at that time as interlinked with the global financial systems as it is today. So that's a lingering fear. You know, as inflation causes trouble around the world, all of these fears are coming back. Number two, as our supply chains get deeper and more integrated, there are questions on where we're going to get the real technology from, especially in AI, and what kind of disruption the infusion of those technologies, including in AI, will do to our labor force, where we're still struggling to provide jobs. I want to ask you how you see these two questions.
Well, I think we have to prepare for the future, and what the outcomes of this visit would indicate is the direction in which both countries seem to be poised, literally, to take off in terms of their cooperation. I think that we have to look at strengthening our manufacturing capacity, because that does create more jobs for our, many millions of people who need that for their livelihoods. But as I said, there is also a very technologically advanced and capable workforce also that we have. And those numbers have increased and are increasing over the years. So given that capability and that talent pool that we have, I think if we are to really be able to galvanize that capability, we have to be able to bring it up, bring up the talent levels and capabilities in accordance with, what the demands of a 21st century industrial ecosystem would be. So that involves more and more engagement with particularly the Western countries, because that is where the technology is, that is where the capital is, and that is therefore, I believe, the reason why we want to build bridges with those countries. So I don't think we should, be doubting Thomas's about it. I don't think we should be skeptical about what might happen in the future. I don't think fear of the future is going to help us at this time when, so much is changing around us. And if India has to really graduate to the position of a leading global power, I think India should be prepared to connect more with the world on the business and investment, technology and capital front. And so the open economic approach that we established, or we inaugurated in 1991 has of course gathered momentum over the years, but I think we have to really reach that kind of escape velocity where we become that center where there is this flow and inflow and outflow of ideas and technology and capital that would make us much stronger and powerful. So we have to be prepared for that.
One of the dissonant note in all of this, Ambassador, is the question of climate finance and climate equity. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has often brought up the question of the global South receiving enough climate finance and climate transformation being equitable for all, rather than it basically being a more burden for the global South. Today, when we are seeing questions of things like carbon tax border and things like that coming from Europe, and the issue of how much finance would be readily available for this climate transition to happen in the global South, do you think this question will continue to linger as a potential bone of contention between India and the US, and indeed between the West and the global South?
I think India should be prepared for these kinds of pressures. But on the other hand, India is, a very powerful pole in the global order today. And India's voice carries a lot of weight and in many ways represents the interests and the concerns of the global South. Take Africa, for instance, and the kind of the leap forward that Africa has to take when it comes to the energy scenario and the kind of new technologies that it requires. I think India can be a representative voice for a lot of these countries, even as it seeks to further its own cause in the climate dialogue, and when it seeks that mitigation and that adaptation that is required to be able to meet the threat of global warming, to allow decarbonization, to reduce methane emissions, to move away from coal. I think the Modi government has done admirably in the last few years when it comes to increasing the share of renewable energy in our energy mix. And I think the way forward is very clear. The impetus is so powerful at this moment for India to be doing. India is doing much, much more. And I think that is recognized globally also. So I really wouldn't say that this is going to be a bone of contention with the United States. We already have an Agenda 2030 with the United States on clean energy. There's a lot of work going on between the research establishments of the two countries, and there is political will on the part of both governments to see cooperation on climate issues and renewable energy and clean energy going forward.
As we come to the last part of this interview, Ambassador, I want to talk to you a little bit about track two between India and the US, so to speak. In the last week, there has been a lot of conversation about how there is historic closeness between India and the US at track one, even track 1.5. But there are constant sort of, notes of, argument, misunderstandings at the track two level. How do you think, and this constantly causes, Indian Twitter to erupt, so to speak, and social media has an impact. Newspapers and other media organizations to have their own commentary about this. What do you think is a logical solution to this? Because this seems to constantly occur and cause tensions, at least at the citizen level, between India and the US.
Well, I think the connections today between Indian think tanks and American think tanks are much stronger and much more vibrant than they ever were before, at least in my memory. I think I think we didn't talk about the people-to-people connections between the two countries, which are really, I think, form the backbone of this relationship. There is this big Indian-American diaspora, which is a great voice for closer relations between India and the United States that really are able to infuse the public domain in the United States with the opportunities to learn and understand India much better. And I think that is a strategic asset which really plays to our benefit and the benefit of both countries, really. So, and there is that other aspect that that if you ask me where I think we should be making progress and improving the situation is, the ties between our universities, for instance, and the ecosystem within the Indian university setup, I think, has obviously to be upgraded, to be improved, so that we can welcome more American students. Let's start with Indian American students. Maybe they can, be the front runners on this, and they can be followed by others among their compatriots. They should be coming to study in India. Our universities should offer programs that would be able to attract more American students to come to India. And the new education policy, I assume, will enable the setting up of campuses of American universities within India, which is what China did, from the 1980s onwards. And that enabled a huge influx of American students into China. And I think we have to increase the attraction that India has for Americans. And so that they are able to want to learn more about us, our diversity, our history, our pluralism, the strength and the nature of our democratic institutions. So I think that study of India in the United States has to be much, much deeper. And similarly, within India, if attitudes have to change and if, we have to have more trust and more confidence about America, I think we have to be able to learn more about that country, learn about its history, about its checkered, progress from its independence from Britain in 1776, what it has gone through in building its democracy, because there are many lessons also to be learned for us from that.
Glad you brought up the diaspora, because that's the last thing I wanted to discuss with you, Ambassador, not just in the United States, but around the world. And this has been repeatedly mentioned by many Indian prime ministers. And now many governments mention it too. The Australians, for instance, refer to the Indian population in their country, or Indian origin population in their country, as a strategic asset, even for themselves, as a national asset. And in many parts of the world, especially in America, Indians are the new 1%, so to speak, most highly educated, highest earners, most integrated, and so on and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of the Indian diaspora. We have talked about in the Indian diaspora everything from Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge and Bollywood movies to, tech, the the H1B visa, which would take a lot of Indian engineers to America. But talk to us a little bit about the strategic importance of this diaspora as it becomes wealthier, more educated, and more connected into the politics of various countries, with more and more Indian origin people participating actively in politics, perhaps in a manner that they wouldn't do before?
I think it's a matter of pride for India, the successes that the Indian diaspora have enjoyed across the world. The contributions they've made to the countries in which many of them have been born and their adopted homelands, as it were, and the connections that they've maintained with India. So they are really the bridge between India and these countries, a very vital human bridge. And I think that is enormously powerful and effective in terms of not only, bringing pride to India, but also in cementing good relations between those countries and India. As we've seen with the United States, you see the mainstreaming of the Indian American community into the center of American life. Prime Minister Modi spoke about it in his address to the two houses of Congress day before yesterday, when he referred to the presence of Vice President Kamala Harris and a number of Indian American members of Congress in the audience also. So especially in the United States, I would say, and then of course in the UK also, you have a Prime Minister of Indian origin. So I think in many ways this represents a coming of age for India, and the dismantlement of, prejudices and stereotypes concerning India that had always kind of muddled perspectives in the past. I think there's a much clearer understanding today about what India is capable of, what Indians stand for, and how they can make contributions to global peace and well-being, literally to the global public good.
As we conclude, my last question, Ambassador, when you look at the India-America relationship, as you said, both incumbent governments in India and America are now headed towards a major election. The global economy, the turmoil in the global economy, in a sense, hasn't gone away. The war in Russia continues perhaps to grow, and we're speaking in a day where it has become even more volatile. Talk to us finally a little bit about how you see the New World Order. It's something that Prime Minister Modi mentioned again and again, that there is a new world order. Things are changing, indeed, perhaps have changed already. Talk to us about a little bit about how you see this new world order and the relationship and the importance of the India-US relationship in this new world order.
Well, Prime Minister Modi stresses the oneness of the world. It's something that has been an overarching theme for the G20, that the summit is going to happen in September. And as far as India sees it, the greatest challenges that we face as humankind are climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and all this can be fought only by nations working together. And there's a very complex set of interconnections that bind us all together in the world of today. And India feels it has the right to work with every country. So that is why, I've said recently that India is positioning itself as the heartland of the global south, because we feel we are a bridging presence that stands for multilateralism, that stands for multipolarity. We want to address our development needs, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education. And I think we have the potential to spread that word, to spread growth, to foster dialogue across the world. And we will continue to act in accordance with our interests. And we want solid relations with the West. There's no doubt about it, especially with the United States. And that's why, the technology partnership is so important to us, because it promotes India's development. It promotes India's capacity to be a force for good in the world, to be that balancer, to be a deterrent against countries that coerce, intimidate. So it's a kind of balancing act, you may say, you may put it as that. We don't know what the future will hold. But a lot of the global order has changed and is changing. In many ways, this is a world without definition. But it is a multipolar world. And India is very much, a player, an influencer, and its capacity to really speak for the global South is very, very evident today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador. As you said at the very beginning of this conversation, to use a Napoleon metaphor, so to speak, this is indeed a bend in the river. Thanks very much for your time, Ambassador, for talking to us. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindol.